Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Wilson, and I am in the Department of Theater and Dance, and I'm joined today by Kamrath and Sean Stone, who are the artistic team who were responsible for filming the musical or the song cycle 29, which will premiere on the 9th of April. And I want to let them speak a little bit about themselves, but our goal today is just to give you some context about the creation of the song cycle and the sort of the things that we learned along the way. Kat.
Great. I'm Kat Kamrath, and I was the choreographer of 29. And I worked closely with Sean throughout the summer to create this vision we had, but then we worked very independently in terms of the artistic sides of things. I am a second year assistant lecturer in the Department of Theater and Dance, and this is my first cross-department collaboration with the department. Sean.
I'm Sean Stone. I am the musical theater teacher in the Department of Theater and Dance. And on the production of 29, I serve as the director, the musical director, and the orchestrator. And together with Pat and Jason Banks, one of the editors for the project as well.
So 29, a song cycle. How did you conceive of this as a production? And why did we do a production that was created for film?
We should call it 29 in parentheses, the Oklahoma that wasn't, because we were supposed to be doing Oklahoma in this production slot. And when the pandemic happened in March, we realized really quickly that that was not going to be a possibility to have 30 people, plus 30 people on stage, plus 30 people in the pit, all singing and blowing air and instruments and stuff hanging out together. Before we knew what show we were going to do, we just tried to figure out how we could accommodate doing any show. What would we have to do to rehearse it? What would we have to do to perform it? And then we figured we'd find a show that would fit the bill.
Part of that came out of our commitment to our students to make sure that they could continue their training and continue the professional work that is so distinctive in theater and dance.
I don't know if you remember that. I remember we all had a meeting very shortly after we realized Oklahoma was going to have to be canceled. And it was me and Kat, and I think Margaret, you might have been there too as well. And Scott, our scene designer, and Don, who manages the shop, and Andrew, and Jason, and the creative team all kind of got together and was just like, if we're going to do this, what does it look like to adhere to all the safety guidelines coming from the CDC, to try and preserve everyone's health and safety as a first and foremost? What would the restrictions be? What would it look like? And we all just went through the guidelines and had a meeting about how to maintain social distancing, how to keep people in their own separate spaces, how to keep people not breathing each other's air. And it just kind of, all the creative stuff came after the practical decisions had been made.
And at that time, we didn't really know what fall semester was going to look like. So we were also working off of a best case scenario, and then also having plan B and plan C and plan D in place, and knowing that whatever we chose creatively was going to then be adaptable for plan A, plan B, plan C, plan D. And I think that we had to start from there because we really wanted to create something that was going to be interesting and valuable to our students, but then we also wanted to keep everybody safe in the process. And so the more voices that came together to create what those safety guidelines were going to be and what that meant for our spaces and for a production like this, then we could then figure out what creative project fit that.
The original emphasis on Oklahoma was intended to be a big collaboration between the dance department and the musical theater departments, which can oftentimes act very separately. And so we decided whatever we wanted to do, that it would still be a project that would maintain equal collaboration from both the singers and the dancers and from the two separate departments, or the two separate branches of our same department, I guess.
Yeah. So actually, can you be a little more specific? Like, what did you do? I mean, how did you get singers safely singing and dancers spaced out in a way that did adhere to and exceeded the university's safety protocols?
Oh yeah, we looked at what the university's protocols were and what the state protocols were, and then we also looked at just what the CDC's recommendations were. I looked at the National Music Teachers and Singing Teachers Associations because the specific nature of singing is a super spreader. They had guidelines that were more specific to the nature of singing as opposed to just general guidelines. And whenever we found guidelines that had been established, we always tried to be more safe and more precautious than they were. Because our students are, we're training them to leave school and have careers where their voices and their bodies are their primary work tool for the rest of their careers. And the last thing we wanted to do was expose any of these students to an illness that no one knew much about that has potentially long-lasting effects, just because we didn't know, and nobody knew at the time, exactly what the downside of catching coronavirus could be. We just wanted to stay as far, far, far away from it as possible.
How did you deal with that in dance then, Kat?
Starting dance rehearsal on Zoom was actually quite challenging because, the university started with 5 weeks online in the fall. And so we needed that rehearsal time. So we couldn't wait until the university allowed in-person classes again to get started. So students were learning all of the choreography in their home spaces, which was quite challenging. And we worked through the difficulties of learning three-dimensional choreography on a two-dimensional screen. And we had some major challenges with that, but we were able to work through it. And then when we came back in person, luckily we were able to come back in person first. And then we worked with a 10-foot distance as part of our guidelines. And so we used that both in the studio to rehearse, and then when we got on stage, we maintained that 10-foot distance. And so for choreography purposes, a lot of the movement stayed in a similar formation. So dancers stayed in their same placement for a full piece because we didn't want to see them moving through that space and changing their distance between each other. But dancers were also learning how to dance in a mask and breathe in a mask, and that was quite challenging for them, especially because there are some quick pieces in 29, and the choreography for musicals, it's very very collaborative in terms of what the music sounds like and what the dance looks like. And so it's really important that the movement tells the story of what the music is sounding like and what the vocals are saying. And so I knew that I needed to push the dancers to match that. And so there was a lot of growth that happened in terms of just their stamina, but then also just the clarity of being spaced out consistently throughout.
I don't know that people are familiar with 29. Sean, how did you find out about, or how did you find 29 as an option for this crazy fall?
29 was a song cycle that I'd actually been a fan of when I lived in New York. I knew the two guys who wrote it. I went to school with them. And so it was a project that they had started working on when we were all at NYU together. And then it kind of grew out of their thesis project. So I had been familiar with it for 15 years, but it's one of those things that I had forgotten about. And it was literally the Facebook reminders of, on this date, 8 years ago, you shared a memory of blah, 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 blah. And I had shared a video of the song, The Argument, which is a song towards the end of the show about a young man who has experienced the near loss of his mother when she goes into the hospital. And it's a really touching song, and it's a really pretty song. And I had completely forgotten about it. And it popped up on my Facebook memories. And I was like, this is exactly the sort of show that we're looking for our project this semester. And so I reached out to Tommy and Gabi, the writers, and told them what we were doing and told them what kind of restrictions we were going to be working under. And they were willing to work with us. They were willing to be adaptable in terms of the adaptation of their original script to a version of a screenplay for us. So they were really great to work with as writers. It's not a common thing to have writers working that closely in the development of a piece and being so generous in terms of giving over their creative control to someone else to adapt it. But they were the best about it. And so we kind of tailored it to suit the way we had to put the piece together.
Can you talk a little bit about the adaptation or the process of an adaptation?
Tommy and Gabi had two versions of 29, one from I think it was 2006 and another from like 2011. The 2006 version was just a song cycle. I shouldn't say just a song cycle. The 2006 version was a song cycle, which is just where each song acts as its own narrative piece, and they kind of string together these independent short stories in song to tell a larger story. The 2011 version had more of a narrative through it. They had kind of given some of these characters more specifics and relationships to each other, and it had more of a narrative through line. And they allowed us to kind of pull from both of these versions and to combine them in a way that would make something that's unique. The version of the film that we are doing is not really either of their staged versions, but it's a lot of both. It's much closer in terms of its format to their original version, that it's a song cycle, but it takes a lot of the rewrite and the development and the things that came out of a later version and incorporated them into the structure of the first version of the piece.
And the original versions did not include dance as a component. So that was something that we added into our version of 29, and we got the permission to add that in. And so that was really important for us when we were looking at what we were going to do, was that we knew dance needed to be a component. And Sean, because he's a master at this, was so great about adding in extra bars to the soundtrack to allow more dance to take place so that we could see the dancers and we can see the vocalists throughout all of these different tracks. So Sean and I had multiple meetings about which scenes included dance, which scenes didn't have dance, which scenes were primarily dance, all those types of things. And then once we made that structure, I went in and told him, here are the areas within each of these scenes that dance is going to be incorporated. And then we figured out when the actors would also have choreography so that the actors could match the dancers, even though they weren't going to be in the same spaces.
And even though we figured all this stuff out on paper, because of the pandemic, we were even rehearsing separately. I mean, in the usual musical, even though I'm not the choreographer, I go to the dance rehearsals and I watch so that, as a director, I know what the dancers are doing. And it's not uncommon at all for the choreographer to come to the actors rehearsal to work with them on the dancers. And we did some of that through Zoom, but we didn't really get to watch what the other one was doing. We just kind of informed each other about what we were doing. So we knew what was happening in theory, but we didn't really have any practical vision of how it was going to be. And we wouldn't through the entire filming process. There was no sense of how it would come together until we approached editing. But that's another chapter.
We've talked a little bit about the dancers, their rehearsal process and sort of their rehearsal environment. Sean, can you talk a little bit about how the vocalists were set up in individual spaces and how that was challenging and yeah, what you learned from that?
The method of how we rehearse the actors actually is kind of an example of making lemonade out of lemons, because for the past several years, we've been talking about wanting to expand our performance areas to include more camera work and more working in film and television aspects and in voiceovers and stuff. And while I think our faculty is unanimous in agreeing that it's something that should happen, because of the university's declining budget in the last few years, we've not really been able to actively make that change occur in our curriculum. And we got some money from the CARES Act to buy some cameras and some equipment for this, which was, ended up being a good thing, because a lot of the stuff that we got through the CARES Act is stuff that we would have gotten had we had the budget to get camera stuff anyway. And it's stuff that we can keep and use for camera work after. We kind of embrace this as an opportunity to dive further into camera work techniques for the actors. And what that looked like, how that manifested, was that every actor was given basically an isolation booth, a private room that they themselves would go into that no one else would go into. Their costumes and props and set pieces would be cleaned and disinfected and left for them in their spaces in advance, as well as their cameras, their lights, their microphones. And so each of the actors had to also act as their own technician, their own props person, their own costume person. They had to take a lot of these responsibilities onto themselves. But by doing so, we could make sure that there was no cross-contamination with any other people. So these individual booths that the actors were put in were anywhere from the size of a closet to, much larger spaces where space wasn't an issue. Each of these spaces was equipped with a green screen, a set of lights, a wireless microphone, and all of the rooms were tethered together into a common control room, which we kept out in the shop. So when we were going through filming this, or going through the filming process, the actors can hear each other. At least the actors who are live and present that day can hear each other through a speaker that's in their room, so that they can adjust their timing to hear the other people. But no one ever saw another person while we were filming. When during rehearsal, we would rehearse through Zoom, and so we could kind of use our own Zoom screens as an example of what the movie screen might look like, and we would set some basic blocking and some staging. But we were not even sure exactly of the size of the rooms the actors would be in until right before they were placed in them. So it really became, the rehearsal, a lot of talking about your work as an actor in terms of your intention and your meaning and your delivery and what you'll do, but not so much as how it gets up and walks around, just because we didn't know how it would get up and walk around. We had no idea.
So I think the other thing that's really unusual about this whole process, just to pick on what you were talking about, Sean, is that we do go through a lengthy rehearsal process, and that is with everyone in the room sort of making choices, creating an ensemble. And then we usually have a what's called a technical rehearsal, where they're adding in lights and costumes. We have 2 of those, and then we go into 2 dress rehearsals, and then we go into 4 to 5 to 6 performances. And that didn't happen for this. Everything got compressed literally to 1 or 2 days of filming. What was that like?
Well, everything got compressed, the rehearsals, the filming, everything. And I think the compression resulted in, there was so much focus that needed to happen on just the technical aspects of everything, that when everything got compressed, that's where the extra time went, was to focus on the technical things. I mean, for example, if you're doing a group music rehearsal, where we have all the cast together and we're just going to sing a song together, in normal life, the actors have learned their notes. I sit down at the piano, I play it for them, we all sing together, and then we can kind of listen to what everything is happening in the room and make corrections and adjustments, and then try it again and try it again and try it again. In this circumstance, the only way we could do that was I pre-recorded all the music and sent it to all the actors and worked with them mostly one-on-one, individually, to teach them all their parts. We didn't really have any group rehearsals up until individually they had already learned the material.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we get together to rehearse a group number, they all have the accompaniment tracks, and I have the accompaniment track. So they mute their microphones on Zoom, and I play the accompaniment through Zoom. They sing their solo part into their telephones, or their smartphones. They email me the MP3 from the recording, which I couldn't hear because everyone is muted. I take these 14 MP3s that have come into my email, send everybody on a 15-minute break, take these 14 MP3s and assemble them in a recording software called Logic underneath the recording track, and adjust the timing and sync everything up as best as I can, not having ever heard them do it in the first place. And then we all come back together and we listen to it once. And that's the one time we stay through it. So what would normally in a normal rehearsal process have taken a couple of minutes would take a half an hour.
For the dancers, they did have the opportunity to rehearse as a group. So they were hearing the music, they could see each other throughout the process. But then when it came to the filming, they were on stage. They had a projection in the back, and there were approximately 6 people in the audience, the directors, the lighting designer, and the film operators. So even though their experience may have been a little bit more traditional, the feedback that we get from the audience, the excitement that we have with having lots of bodies in the space, even if you can't see them. How did you help the dancers through that to try and get them to create a performance quality in a way that they haven't been asked to before?
It was definitely an interesting experience because it felt like normal, but was very much not normal. So yes, the dancers were able to be on the stage, and we had full costumes and we had full lights, and the process seemed very similar. But then we were condensing parts of it. So we ended up taking 8 days of filming for the 16 dance scenes. And in those 8 days, they were called based on scenes that they were in. So we shot three to four scenes a night, and some of those scenes were split between two groups. So they would be called and they would have multiple pieces they were doing that night. They didn't have a traditional dress rehearsal. We just showed up. The lights were, however, the lights were set. The projection was there ready to go. We focused the cameras. They had already been on stage staging for multiple weeks in rehearsal. And normally we have some like dress rehearsal runs before we perform. But this one was just like, you're just doing it. And so I think in some ways, the dancers enjoyed that because they had less time to think about all the possibilities of things that could happen during performance. But then it was also like you were just getting tossed into the deep end because you did it or you didn't. And I think one of the other things that the students really enjoyed was the fact that they got multiple takes of the same scene. So we did each piece 3 to 4 times so that we could get different camera angles and just like knowing that we had lots of footage that we could then edit from. But for dancers, normally we just get one take. You go on the stage, you do your piece, then you're done. And then the next piece goes. And so it was, they had the ability to just instantly fix something if something didn't go the way they wanted it to in the take before it. But in terms of performance, we do feed off of the energy of the audience. And for the cast, they were then just performing for 3 camera operators, for whatever technicians were in the space. So our lighting designer, our stage manager, our production manager. I was way up in the back of the house looking at the camera feeds for all the different monitors to make sure that everything was coming in the right way. And I think the dancers just had to imagine the audience being there, and they're all fully capable of pulling out the performance energy without there being an audience there, knowing that eventually the audience would be watching them. And so I think I didn't necessarily change the way I was teaching them. I just asked them to pull it from inside themselves instead of taking it from that energy and the adrenaline that comes during performance time.
Musical theater majors do everything. They sing, they act, they move. I know that for some of the performers, they were in very small spaces. And so, Sean, how did you help them sort of find that physicality when literally there was a wall, 3 feet away from them on either side?
Well, and that was something that Kat and I worked on together, was because Kat had rehearsals with the actors, teaching them their choreography, and she would come in and watch and make adjustments for them. This is where, like so many things in making the show, the answer is just, well, it was the practical way. It wasn't the creative way, it wasn't the inspired way. We just went with the practical way. Everyone was in different sizes of spaces. If the wall was too short, you have to make adjustments. And then because everyone couldn't see, the cast members couldn't see one another, when we had to have one cast making a major adjustment, we would try and echo that in the rest of the cast so that everyone is still creating something that looks unified, even though that they only are aware of what they themselves are doing. And there's a little bit of cat wrangling in that, trying to lead people blindly, making minute adjustments that for them probably feel the same, but for us, we're just trying to match everything up together.
Mm-hmm. It's almost like the space was the third director. It's like, This is what you're able to do.
Well, the same way that the actors and dancers play off of an audience and there's that chemistry between the stage and the house, the actors also have that amongst themselves on stage, especially when you talk about timing and comedy and how, comedy is like a tennis game between the actors hitting a ball back and forth, and you're kind of hitting a ball somewhere thinking that someone's going to hit it back, but you can't really see that they are or where it's coming when it does, so it's a little bit of blind work for all of them as well.
every creative process is about working with some type of limitation. And sometimes those are limitations that we put on ourselves, and sometimes those are things that come from some other external force. And I think in this process, all of my limitations came from protocols. So making sure students are distanced, making sure that they're masked, knowing that I could only fit 12 people on stage at a time when I had 19 in the dance ensemble. And so then reimagining what those pieces look like, because in my head it was that everybody was going to be on stage together, and now they can't be on stage together ever. So what does the choreography look like between two groups? And when are there opportunities to make it seem like they're dancing at the same time in the same space? And so some of my choreographic moments include one group looking at the other. So one group is dancing with their left side and the other group is dancing with their right side. So it feels like they are moving intentionally toward each other, which then comes in the editing process because they were never on stage at the same time. And so I think the limitations I was working with was making sure that I was being consistent in spacing, and um, and therefore being less creative with spacing, because all of these formations are just lines of people. And then also just working with different levels of things. So luckily, Scott, our scenic designer, and the rest of our shop team put together some risers for the back of the stage so we could add some more height, since we knew that the cameras were going to be looking in just one kind of flat angle. And dancers had to then adapt what their choreography looked like, because the risers were shallower than the space that we were using. And they were steady, but you're also off the ground. So there's a little bit of anxiety that comes with that, especially when the dancers were up there in their heels, which weren't very high, but you're already kind of unsteady when you're dancing in heels, and then you're on a platform. So I think that experience was good for them, because they were then learning how to adapt choreography for their situation, and I was learning how to adapt choreography for our situation, and what it meant to find a lot more clarity in the movement, because I wanted it to read on screen. And so being really specific about the angles of the body, of the direction they were moving, of the energy that they had, of increasing those things, because I wanted it to read when it became two-dimensional. So those were just some layers that were added on to my choreographic process that aren't typically there.
What happens after the rehearsing and filming is done?
Oh, geez. Before this project, we are not a film department. We are a theater, and we still are a theater and dance department. You know, we are not, we are doing film out of necessity. So when we started doing this, we were aware that at some point after we're done filming, someone has to edit the footage together. We don't really have an editor in our faculty because we're not a film program. So we just kind of figured that we would do it ourselves. And having never edited a film before, I just kind of pushed that off until the very end of rehearsals and filming. I didn't really have time to learn how to edit beforehand. So I just kind of took a crash course in editing as we went, as it happened. Let's see, we finished filming on November 15th. I remember because it was my birthday. So we finished filming on November 15th. And at the time, I remember thinking that we'll probably work all through Christmas break and have a finished editing project by then. And by the time Christmas break was done, I think I had 5 out of the 25 scenes edited. So, you know, and granted, the first couple of weeks of that, at least for me, we're just learning how to use the software, learning what the interface is to get the work done. But also, all of the things that we did to keep the actors safe and isolated in rehearsal and in filming ended up being a lot more work in editing. Every one of those green screens that they're standing in front of has to be edited out. The footage has to be compiled together. And we also recorded audio and video in separate places. So the first thing is that the singing and the video has to be married together. And just the process of making all the files ready to be editing is about more than half of the time of the complete editing. It's just technical, moving things in the right place, editing things together, organizing a bunch of video files, you know. And then because none of the actors could see each other, everyone's in different frames, everyone's in different sizes, people have different colors of light. There's just all these kind of adjustments to make. And so the editing in itself is a lot more practical and less inspired, at least from my part. You just kind of look at all the pieces that are there and try and figure out the best way to put them together. And it's just kind of trial and error.
I think it's also worth mentioning, we certainly had a number of the vocalists in the Buchanan Center, but we had vocalists in their homes in Laramie. We also had vocalists in Texas and California. So, you know, just the logistics of setting all that up was pretty amazing. But, you know, I sort of look at I have dabbled in film editing, and it is a lot like composing and choreography in a way. You're taking these materials and you're trying to figure out how they can fit together, how you can transition from one to the next. And I don't think people do estimate the amount of time that takes, and also sort of the artistic vision that both of you would have brought to that process.
It's so much fine detail work. I mean, it's like painting with a little teeny tiny brush, and every stroke, you know, then adds up to make this larger, bigger thing. When you're looking at telling a story through film versus telling a story through stage, there's something inherently different in the way that movement tells a story. And I think it has to do with how your eye tracks what it is that you're capturing. You know what I mean? When you're an audience looking in a theater, you're sitting here looking at this great big space and things are moving around on it. And so your eye moves to track the things in the space. When you want a character to convey power or dominance on stage, you give them movement. You make people track the movement with your eye, you know? When you're watching something on a screen, it's the camera that moves. And so your eye becomes stationary on the screen that you're watching, and the camera allows you for the changes in perspective. And so for people to have dominance and power as characters on screen, it's the stillness that captures the eye, you know? And that's not something I even thought about or realized until I started editing these things together. Trying to just, because the way that you tell a story, the way things move to tell a story is completely counterintuitive to what I'm used to as a theater director.
And I think we really conceived of this project as really two separate areas. Like Sean was really working with the actors and the vocalists in one way, and I was really working with the dancers in another. And when we went into the editing process, it was about how do those things actually thread together, like physically thread together on our screens, in a way that we didn't necessarily talk about or conceive of as we were in the physical creative process. And so now, you know, Sean's going through and figuring out the different ways to use composition to put the dancers and the actors in the same space on the screen in a way that we didn't actually do in person. And so it feels like now it's just another creative venture. Like there's different creative chapters of 29, and I feel like the edited version of 29 is going to feel much different to those that were physically a part of it, because it's arranged in a way that we couldn't have conceived of doing it live.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's totally true. One of the scenes is a short book scene, a scene with no song, just a conversation scene called Snow Angels. When we talk about how we want to direct it and edit it together, and keep in mind, you know, everyone's in their own rooms on green screen. We have the idea of creating this picture that we're looking into an apartment through a window, and at the window, one of the roommates is sitting here looking out of the window, stringing popcorn together on a string, getting ready for Christmas. And the other roommate is sitting back behind her, reading a book in a chair facing the wall opposite, and they're having this conversation. So when we rehearse that and film that with Aubrey and Maddie, all Aubrey knows is she's sitting here in a chair looking forward, stringing stuff together. Maddie knows that she's in a chair pointed sideways, but they don't really have a sense of, you know, when we say Aubrey talked to Maddie, Maddie talked to Aubrey, what they're really doing is finding an X that they've taped on the wall so that their sidelines match. but they don't have any sense of what it'll look like. And because it's all green screen, as a director, I don't have any sense what it'll look like. That's when I go to Scott, our scenic designer, and kind of explain the composition that I've got set up. And then Scott comes back with a layer that is the front of the building and the window that we see through. And then the half wall that's behind Aubrey that we see Maddie over. And then the entire wall in the background. And all these things get stacked up in terms of opacity. What do we see through and what's in front and what's behind? And it all gets layered together. But even the people who are making it, me and the actors and Scott, don't have any idea of how that assembles until it's all the way through editing. Another really interesting way that editing affected the dance and the songs is in the number, the musical number Looking for a Roommate, which is about one guy's quest to find a roommate, and he interviews all these awful, terrible roommates. And the way Gabi and Tommy allowed us to adapt the scene actually kind of modernized the feeling. When you're doing a song cycle on stage, you know, someone just stands up and the audience understands this is the next roommate. But on a film, it doesn't make sense to have suddenly just kind of magically appear. So Gabi and Tommy allowed us to add the devices that all these interviews are happening through FaceTime calls, through computer calls, through telephone calls, so that we get to see different modes of communication, which kind of gives us that sense of isolation that a pandemic would have. But then Scott, the scenic designer, gives us an element of an apartment building with all these windows, you know? And so then we can take all the little people and put them in the windows that you see in a building. It's like everyone is living there. And that's not an idea that any of us had when we were coming up with the choreography, when we were doing the directing, when we were talking about character, how it's going to be staged. That was not a concept that was even on the table. That's an element that comes a lot later when we see what the scenery will be and we see how it can be pieced together. It's creating art out of necessity. These are the pieces we have. This is how they fit together. This is what that looks like. It's been a good teaching tool for the kids because when you talk about creating something, you get to the point where it's not about that there are right answers and there are wrong answers in the creative process. There are functional answers given what you have to work with. And so you take the material and the tools that you have and you figure out how to cobble that functionality and stuff into a larger thing. You know, collaborative projects create something that is larger than just the addition of the pieces. They work together exponentially to trigger chemistry in each other that wasn't there before, which is what makes the creative process, I think, so unique. Especially in something like this, when you have so many moving creative pieces coming from so many different people. There's so much input. It's like making a big stew and everybody gets to bring their own flavor and add it into the pot.
I think one thing that the audience should anticipate is that this film was made at a very specific time in our in the last year of our lives, and we'll, you know, the dancers are in masks, and how that will be, you know, sort of a reminder of the limitations and the isolation or the distance that we felt. But I, you know, I also think it will be a celebration of that. It's like, look what we did in spite of all of this. And so I'm very excited to see it.
Together we'll go round the rink, round the rink, round the rink, round the rink. La 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 la
And go.
To be or not to be? That is the question. Whether it is nobler. Sorry.